Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Smith. I sit in the Frank Schranz Chair in Professional Ethics in the Albers School of Business and Economics, and I also direct the Center for Business Ethics. And I want to welcome everyone to tonight's event, which is co-hosted by the Center for Business Ethics and the university's Ethics and Technology Initiative. We're happy to have everyone here tonight to hear from one of just a few, I would say, nationally recognized experts on online abuse, propaganda, disinformation, and the ethics of AI-driven social media. Our guest is Renee DiResta, a research professor at Georgetown University. You probably have seen her as a public figure in all sorts of ways in many places, on PBS, CNBC, The Washington Post, testifying before the United States Congress. But you might know her more by her recently released book called Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. So we're going to have a nice conversation with her and her work today. Renee DiResta has visited a joint meeting of an honors and business communications class this morning. We had a nice luncheon discussion as well, so we're really putting her to service while she's here at Seattle University. We're going to have a slightly more in-depth introduction to Professor DiResta and her work shortly, but before I do that, I want to invite Joseph Phillips, Professor of Economics and Dean of the Albers School of Business and Economics, to the podium to provide some added welcome remarks.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, and it's a great honor to be able to welcome everybody here, and thank you for joining the Center for Business Ethics discussion that's been organized with Renee DiResta. There's nothing more pressing than an examination of how we are led and sometimes misled by emerging information technologies and online influencers. And if I'm allowed to say this, it's unfortunate, but the timing of this discussion could not be better for us. At the heart of this challenge are the businesses and regulators who hold the keys to all this. And tonight we will get a glimpse into the inner workings of how technology can hinder and support our democracy, and what we might all do to help confront the threats to some of our most basic institutions and to so many things that we have been taking for granted for so long. The Center for Business Ethics was founded in 2011 and serves as the focal point for the programming in ethics and corporate responsibility of the Albers School. Since its inception, it has been where interdisciplinary academicians and business leaders work together to advance applied research and public discussion of ideas that align with our core mission around ethics and social responsibility. To that end, engagement with contemporary social problems, especially those confronting businesses in our region, is central to what we do. Keynote events like this evening support and reinforce the Center's various programs. Its Faculty Fellows program enables faculty from across the university to pursue their original work across disciplines to generate the study of ethics and the role of business in society into their research. The Center's Northwest Ethics Network brings together business leaders from around the Puget Sound to discuss best practices and how to manage ethical risks and develop ethical organizational cultures. And the Center's ongoing efforts to support ethics across the curriculum reminds us that the professional formation and civic preparation of our students is a critical part of what we do. So I want to thank Jeffrey and his team for pulling this together, as well as the other co-sponsors for organizing this very timely presentation. And again, welcome and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks to the Dean. His support of the Center is unwavering and is a tangible reminder that just about everything we do as faculty in the School of Business is sort of anchored in thinking about all of the business disciplines through the lens of sort of ethics and social responsibility. So thanks again, Joe, for that unwavering support. To do some brief formal introductions before we turn things over to our guest, I want to introduce Roja Karanam, the Frank Schrontz Scholar and Graduate Assistant for the Center for Business Ethics. Roja is completing her Master's of Science in Finance, and prior to arriving at Seattle University 2 years ago, she worked extensively in India, where she is a chartered accountant. She's been an extremely valuable partner the last 2 years in helping to plan these kinds of events, and is really invested in tonight's topic and the work of Professor DiResta. And so I thought it would be appropriate, since she's graduating in the spring, to let her do the formal introduction. And so I will turn things over now to Roja.
Good evening, everyone. So today we are honored to have with us Renee DiResta, who brings a wealth of knowledge on critical issues related to media, misinformation, and the state of our democracy. And I have to say this after spending a lot of time researching her work, writing a teaching note about her impact, and diving deep into her insights on online disinformation. I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to see her in person. So Renee DiResta is one of the leading voices in understanding how information, both real and false, spread across our digital world. Currently a research professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, she has spent years uncovering the mechanics of misinformation, online propaganda, and the informational forces shaping our democracy. Her journey began with a simple but powerful question: why do some ideas spread like wildfire while others fade into the void? This curiosity led her to groundbreaking work where she helped expose how social media was being weaponized to manipulate public opinion. She played a pivotal role in uncovering Russian interference in US elections, studying AI-driven disinformation, and pushing for more transparency in how platforms amplify certain narratives. Her public commentaries have appeared in publications such as Atlantic and Foreign Affairs. More recently, Ms. DiResta wrote in New York Times about her own run-in with conspiracy theorists. So this targeted her research with the Stanford Internet Observatory, which exposed the inner workings of the Trump myth that the 2020 elections were stolen. The integrity of this work received support last summer when the United States Supreme Court ruled that government agencies can, in practice, communicate directly with social media firms and researchers to help reduce online disinformation. Her latest book, Invisible Rulers: The People Who Turn Lies into Realities, explores the powerful intersection of media influences, platform algorithms, and public perception. But what makes DiResta's work truly special is not just her ability to analyze the problems. It's her commitment to finding solutions. From advocating for better content moderation policies to exploring innovative tools like middleware that gives users more control over the online experiences, she is on the front lines of the battle for truth in the digital age. Also joining us tonight as a discussant is Dr. Caitlin Carlson, a prominent researcher in the field of communication and a distinguished professor and faculty fellow of the Center for the Business Ethics. As an expert in media law, free speech, and ethical complexities on online behavior, she explores the intersection of technology, democracy, and influence, and offering insights into the future of information, public discourse, and the role of social media platforms in shaping society. And also her book, Hate Speech, was published in 2021 by MIT Press. So now get ready for an engaging and thought-provoking dialogue. And to begin, I present again Renee DiResta. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hey there, it is so great to be here tonight. I am very excited to give you what is kind of a brief book talk. It's going to go into what's in the book, and then I am really excited to have the conversation that we're going to have afterwards, which I think is going to tie into even some of the stuff that happened this afternoon. So let's just dive right in. I want to take us back in time to September of last year. So this post appeared on a Springfield, Ohio social media platform. It was one of these things that nobody really paid attention to for a couple weeks. It kind of sat on this platform. It was this woman, she was absolutely convinced that this was a real thing that had happened in her community. Her neighbor's friend's cat had gone missing. She posted about it. And it didn't stay on Facebook, though. This was a genuine concern that she had, but what happened was, because it seemed a little bit, strange, it was screenshotted, it was taken off Facebook, posted to Twitter, and on Twitter, it went viral. So once things go viral on Twitter, it's a little bit hard to kind of control, what happens next. How many people saw pictures like this on social media? Yeah. So these are mostly made with Grok. The public began to make memes about the situation. So most of these memes came from Donald Trump's supporters. Donald Trump himself posted that last one on Truth Social. That's where I got that image from. But so these images were really intended to kind of it was very participatory, it was very fun. The people who were sharing them, they were all in on the joke. Nobody thought that these were real, nobody was really fooled by them. This is what modern kind of political propaganda looks like. Nobody is fooled by the AI. They're using the AI to contribute, to sort of share in a political narrative that is interesting to them, that kind of reflects a belief that they have about the world. But the allegations in the post, when they make it to Twitter, when they go viral, there are also elements of it that are not really so funny, that are actually sort of turned into something more serious. So on September 9th, we have J.D. Vance, at the time the vice presidential candidate, saying, months ago I raised the issue of Haitian illegal immigrants draining social services. Where is the border czar, right? So he takes this and he turns it into a very serious thing. It's not something funny at all for him. It's something that he uses as a statement about immigration. So he is taking it from being a rumor, something that people are talking about. Again, that first poster really sincerely does believe this. The people who are initially sharing it really sincerely do believe it before it becomes a meme. But what Mr. Vance is doing here, what Vice President Vance now is doing here, is he's turning it into a piece of political propaganda. He's turning it into a bigger story, a story that really is reflecting a political opinion about immigration. And he begins to talk a little bit more about it. He's using particular types of tones. Spare your outrage for your fellow citizens suffering under Kamala Harris's policies. Be outraged at yourself for letting this happen. So this kind of comes to have a particular phrase, they're eating the pets. They're eating the pets becomes the shorthand for this particular narrative, this meme as it's happening. And I was actually sitting in an airport bar as this debate is happening, and it's playing on the screen. And all these people are sitting around, we're all waiting for our flights, and all of a sudden, Donald Trump says, they're eating the cats. And he goes on this kind of multi-minute rant about how they're eating the cats. And in this airport bar, people who are familiar with it, some people start laughing. I start laughing. But then there's also these people who have absolutely no idea what he's talking about, because this is an extremely online thing. And if you are not on Twitter, if you are not on Facebook, you have probably not heard this rumor. You have absolutely no idea what the man is talking about. And if you actually see it reflected in Google search trends at the time, you see this sort of this collection of everybody in America who's watching this debate going and searching eating the pets. Like, what is he talking about? What is happening here? So all of a sudden, all the people who are not extremely online are themselves kind of confronted with this question of who is eating the pets, what is eating the pets about. It makes it to TikTok. I don't know how many people have seen that video. That was an incredible video. This man is I guess you could, maybe reggae is I don't know how you'd even describe it, puts it on a soundtrack. You have several people, in fact, who set eating the pets to music. It kind of becomes then a left-wing meme because it then becomes a source of mockery. The idea that they are eating the pets is a joke. Once it becomes a source of mockery, the right doesn't just give it up, because this is something that has really, become, again, political propaganda. This is something that is this is a story about immigration now. It is a useful story about immigration. And when the Wall Street Journal and others are saying, like, actually, no, they're not eating the pets. The governor of Ohio, a Republican, says nobody is eating pets. There's no reports of anybody eating pets. Christopher Rufo, right-wing influencer, literally places a $5,000 bounty, says, go and find me evidence that people are eating pets. So again, we're now working backwards. We have the conclusion already, now we need to find some evidence for it. And so some random guy finds this old video on Facebook with animals on a grill, and there is an entire cycle, a day-long internet cycle, of people trying to figure out whether those are chickens or something else. We wind up then with people saying to J.D. Vance, again, so you have the people trying to make sense of what the animals on the grill are. This is incredibly ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous to relay this story, but J.D. Vance then turns this into like, well, really it doesn't matter if it actually happened. It doesn't matter if there were any actual cats. What matters is that the story is important, and the story is, I am willing to tell stories to highlight the plight of the forgotten people of Springfield. So this is actually kind of an extraordinary admission. Stories so that the American media actually pays attention. It is a blatant acknowledgement. He is not saying the word propaganda, but that is actually what it is. The problem is, though, that what happens online doesn't stay online, and so by September 16th, September 30th, what you have is bomb threats that are being called in as people get very angry about the pet-eating Haitians of Springfield over here, and then you have an Ohio businessman, a Republican, who goes and tries to diffuse the situation by saying, actually, I'm hiring these hardworking immigrants, they're valued members of the community. He in turn gets death threats, and this story just kind of continues to spiral, and so it goes on for multiple weeks. I picked this particular example because I think from start to finish, it illustrates how you have something that goes from being a rumor, like a really sincerely held belief that somebody posts, not realizing how extraordinarily decontextualized it can actually become, and then it becomes a piece of political propaganda because these little stories, these little things that we might not think about as we share them are actually incredibly useful, and social media platforms are particularly good as tools of sharing narratives, getting information out there. When you add in memes, they become very, very participatory. Anybody can go and create content and become part of this dynamic of sharing information, helping their community learn about things, or providing content that the once again President of the United States might even pick up and share. It's kind of an honor to be part of that process for supporters of the president. And again, I picked it, but when I gave this talk in November, I think I had 2 hurricanes to work with, and so I kind of briefly switched to talking about images from hurricanes. Depending on, right now we've got Doge happening. I could have picked probably one of 30 stories that have happened over the last 2 weeks with regard to Social Security payments to people in Ukraine or condoms going to Gaza. It doesn't matter what it is. What happens is it's a process and it's repeating itself over and over and over again. And the way that I describe it in the book is a sort of intersection of the propaganda machine and the rumor mill. These two systems for shaping public opinion that were once actually very, very distinct that have really collided now within one technological ecosystem. So just to give a little bit of academic clarification for what these terms mean, rumors are narratives. They're explanations for events in the world, and they frequently challenge official stories. They are not misinformation. They often spread before the truth can even be known, and they sometimes do turn out to be true. They're very sticky. They're persistent. They tend to recur, and they're very participatory. And that's because for all of human history, people have shared stories with each other. The act of me repeating a rumor to you is actually an indication that I trust you, that I think of you as somebody that I'm sharing something with. I want you to have that information also because it might be helpful to you. It used to be that kind of sharing was bounded by geography. You told your friend, who told her friends, who told their friends, but you generally were all part of that same sort of social sphere or circle. If rumors are participatory, we're all part of shaping that knowledge system together, there's also for centuries been this other kind of narrative shaping system, which for a very long time, ordinary people did not participate in. So this one kind of moved information from the top down. Official voices and preferred sources, right, media outlets and people with power delivered approved messages via a mass media ecosystem that they largely controlled. So the recipients of the messages, the people who received the messages, were much more passive. They didn't really have an opportunity to participate in shaping those messages. Now, some people were always kind of better at creating propaganda than others. And the title of my book, Invisible Rulers, actually comes from an Edward Bernays quote. Edward Bernays was a propagandist. In the Creel Commission, his job during World War I was to sell the war to the American public. And in 1929, he wrote a book called Propaganda. He would become known as the father of public relations because selling ideas and selling corporate products and selling politicians and making corporate reputations all kind of rely on the same skill set. And he has this quote, there are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men that we have never heard of. And in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or in our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. And it is they who pull the wires that control the public mind. And in Brené's time, there was this belief that the invisible rulers, the people who were, in a sense, the opinion shapers, that they were doing something that was inherently good, that propaganda was a valuable tool because it was absolutely necessary for generating public consensus. And that he argues in this 1929 book that this is something that it is actually the obligation of the government to do in order to keep society functioning, because someone somewhere has to be producing consensus. And so it was not, in the 1920s, seen as a bad thing. And the other thing that Bernays argues is that it was critical that propaganda, or marketing, appealed to a person's identity as a member of a group, that people were going to shape each other's interpretation of reality, and if you could appeal to somebody as a member of a group and convince them that they wanted to participate in something as a member of a group, then they would in turn kind of spread that information to other people who were members of the group. There's kind of a notorious example where he had a client, I think it was Virginia Slims cigarettes, and he rebrands them as torches of freedom. And he decides that he's going to convince women to smoke cigarettes because at the time, women were not particularly liberated, and so he brands the cigarette as a sign of being a liberated and independent woman, and so it becomes a marker for the liberated independent woman to smoke. And that's how he goes about using that deep desire, that psychological desire, combined with the recognition that there was going to be some social contagion if you could appeal to people and their identity as a member of a group. So by 1947, you have the social science-informed understanding from Katz and Lazarsfeld that public opinion was shaped not so much from top-down media, actually, but from this process of people talking to each other through what they called opinion leaders. And that act of participating in a group was incredibly powerful because opinion leaders, oftentimes women in this community that Katz and Lazarsfeld were studying, took messages from the media, but then they contextualized it amongst themselves. They decided what was true and what was important amongst themselves. So in the era of nearly all prior media environments, as messages were broadcast to the audience, the opinion leaders were taking things from these different ecosystems. They were receiving the messages, they were talking about them kind of amongst themselves, but that was sort of where it stopped. They didn't really have the capacity to be the messengers themselves, to be the opinion shapers. So they were limited to their discussion, making sense of the world, but they didn't have the capacity to really act. The rumor mill and the propaganda machine were comparatively distinct. Then this ecosystem emerges. And now here, we're all active participants, right? We're all content creators. We can all be influencers. We can all be meme makers. We can all be active participants. The opinion leaders, the influencers, are the media as well. So we're receiving information from people that we're also talking to. We're shaping opinions even as we're putting out content. The lines have blurred and the gatekeepers are gone. And so for better or worse, people actually have an immense power to shape public opinion, including political opinion in ways that we've never had before. And one of the things that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit is like my own kind of personal areas of research actually get into what are the incentives, what are the affordances that shape behavior. I think we're in a business school, you maybe have heard the Charlie Munger phrase, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes, right? And if you think about social media, that's really quite glaringly obvious. It's the structure of the system. It's the incentives that the platforms are operating under, keeping you on site, that create certain incentives for creators, getting audiences to pay attention, that lead people to make certain types of content, to communicate in particular ways, to try to get attention in particular ways. And it's the design, the structure of this system, right? And people are essentially the glue between all of these different apps as we move content from one to the other, as we create content, as you take the meme that you made on Twitter and share it to Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social, wherever you are, the features, the politics, the design, this in aggregate sets the rules for the game, it sets the rules of the game for modern influence. So if the power structure of top-down mass media was centered around the broadcaster, right, and his relationship to advertisers and to sources, which was sort of how Noam Chomsky described it in the book Propaganda in the 1980s, well, in this media ecosystem, the power structure of a bottom-up participatory media ecosystem, social media, is this triad, right? So you have influencers, algorithms, and crowds, online crowds, sort of the follower dynamic, the participatory communities that talk to and with the influencer. When you are sharing or engaging with content, you're creating signal, you're creating engagement that algorithms pick up on, which leads the algorithms to push that content out to still more people, to generate more engagement. These three things function as a sort of a holistic ecosystem. And what winds up happening is that when you have these three things functioning around a particular political topic of conversation, like they're eating the pets, what you see happen is that you can't have one without the other. So if the influencer is producing content that no one is reacting to, then the algorithm won't boost it and won't put it out to more people. So it is that relationship between the influencer and the crowd that is actually more important than anything else. So the power to influence opinions lies with those who can most effectively disseminate a message. And while that is still being done top-down via broadcast media in some ways, broadcast commentary is increasingly picking up what people are saying online. So what you'll often see happen is that the commentary that's happening on news media ecosystems, the commentary that's happening on Fox News or on MSNBC is talking about what the influencer algorithm crowd ecosystem has made the topic of conversation that day. So it is talking about what has happened on social media that day. When we talk about what has gone viral on social media that day, when we talk about virality, it's very often described in the passive voice, right? We say it went viral. But virality is not actually passive at all. Virality happens because all of us click the like or the share button. We all engage with the content. It's a function of influencers, algorithms, and crowds taking very, very deliberate actions. In aggregate, virality is a function of collective behavior. It's a function of all of us deciding that something is interesting, signaling demand for it, and that is what makes content take off and go viral. So it's often talked about as if there is some magical algorithmic process that has happened, but it's really actually very much a reflection of demand and interest, and it is one of these things where I think the crowd is not always fully conscious of the role that we play when we engage on social media, that we're really very actively contributing and participating in a particular ecosystem. When we think the memes are funny, when we're clicking the share button, we are actually contributing to, in this case, a political conversation. So virality matters because it captures attention in the moment, but the other thing that we see is that it really invests the participants also. You become really interested in the thing that you have chosen to share. You want to figure out where that content is going, where that conversation is going, where that idea is going. In 2015, I was an activist, living in California. I had a day job. I was at a startup. It was my company actually. But I also had I had my first child in 2013. And I'd kind of become a pro-vaccine activist by accident. There was a measles outbreak at Disneyland, and much like now, actually, right? And I was so incredibly irritated by it because, there were like measles exposures on the subway, and my son was too young to be fully vaccinated. And I just thought it was kind of outrageous that I had to worry about, giving a preventable disease that had supposedly been eradicated in the US, like to my child and, living in California in 2015. It just seemed kind of crazy. But what was amazing to me was that when I looked at vaccine content on social media in 2015, the things that would trend, the things that would go viral about the measles outbreak and everything else was anti-vaccine content. There was no visible pro-vaccine message. The stuff that was going viral, again, the people who were sitting there clicking the like and share button were anti-vaccine activists who were deeply passionate about spreading their message. And people like me were sort of quietly irritated by it, but there was no real effort to grow any kind of counter movement or to do anything that was that really competed in any material way. What this meant was that if you were on Facebook as a new mom, it turns out when you have a baby, Facebook pretty quickly changes your content. You start getting referred into a lot of mom groups. And it started referring me into anti-vaccine mom groups because that was the content on the platform. That was what it had available to curate and to show people. And so it was the realization that what people chose to do, how people chose to show up, how people chose to engage, it wasn't just the algorithms returned what they had available, but in order for good content to trend, in order for good content to show up in the recommendation engine, people had to feel compelled to create it for some reason. And they really didn't. And so it actually took a measles outbreak in Disneyland, and then some of us just kind of getting irritated about the fact that there didn't seem to be any kind of pro-vaccine counter movement to say like, well, I guess we should try to create one. I guess we should try to do it. And so we did, and we tried to pass a law in California to eliminate what was called the personal belief exemption, which just let you kind of sign a paper and say, I'm just not going to vaccinate my child for kindergarten. And I thought that was crazy too. So we worked on eliminating that opt-out, and we got that again. We did that successfully. But what was kind of wild about it was, as we were doing this, we kept kind of waiting for some sort of expert, to kind of come in and make this their cause. We kept waiting for the CDC or somebody to take ownership, to make, like, whose job is it from public health? Isn't this their job? Isn't there supposed to be somebody in government somewhere doing this? Like, isn't there somebody else who is supposed to be responsible for doing this? Why is it just some random moms with Facebook and Instagram accounts saying, I guess we should grow a pro-vaccine counter movement? And after we passed the law, we actually got invited to come to the CDC conference. And we were down there, and I remember having conversations with them, and I said, why aren't you guys in the conversation? These people on social media, the conversation is so egregiously tilted in one direction. Do you not feel any sense of urgency, any sense of a need to be in it? And they said to me, those are just some people online. And ultimately, people still listen to their doctors. And ultimately, people will still choose to vaccinate their kids. And I think about that now because I was like, they really don't know, do they? They really don't understand how wrong they are. And then, 5 years later, we got COVID, and 5 more years later, here we are with a measles outbreak in Texas, and we're still trying to catch up. And the idea that it was just some people on the internet, and that authority figures and institutions were just going to kind of continue to be trusted because this top-down ecosystem was going to continue to be the thing that shaped public opinion, was so wrong. And they kind of just didn't see it coming. And so I think right now, you're seeing a lot of people really struggling and trying to reckon with what has happened now that public opinion is very much shaped from the bottom up. And if you're not participating in those networks, if you don't have influencers, if you don't have amplification chains, then you are not in a position to influence public opinion and to get your message out. If you're not able to make it trend, you're not really participating in the public conversation. You're just not in the discourse in the way that you need to be. So the crowd really matters. And I think one of the sort of byproducts of this infrastructure and incentive system is that you did start to see the rise of political factions, right, who would kind of put emojis in bio. So there is very much a rise of kind of highly niche activist communities. I think that that's great. You are seeing people begin to realize that at a kind of activist community level that they are in there and they are having those conversations and they are getting their points across. I think institutions are really not there. They really don't understand, but you are starting to see people across the political spectrum recognize that this is how public opinion is shaped. And so Americans of all stripes are kind of taking advantage of the opportunity to participate in the public conversation. I think factions are important because they give us an understanding of our group identity. And referencing kind of that thing that Bernays referred to so long ago, they give people a sense of camaraderie and participation, and they help establish boundaries and norms and beliefs. And when they are kind of deployed for political reasons, as with eating the pets, they give people a sense of mission and camaraderie. And they're often really a lot of fun for people, and that's why this is continuing to happen. So I opened the talk by talking about a very particular rumor, kind of bouncing back and forth between the rumor mill and the propaganda machine. But I'll just sort of show you a little bit of academic work that had kind of that we did in 2020 at Stanford Internet Observatory, and in conjunction with your kind of near neighbors, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. So this is a slide that Kate's team, Kate Starbird from University of Washington CIP made. This is a graph of Sharpiegate with our little EIP logo. That was kind of our joint team project. And it just sort of shows, when I was talking about, I gave you kind of the qualitative overview of eating the pets. But if you were to look at it quantitatively, you see these sort of like things where there are these inflection points where a particular influencer tweets something and it just sort of, these sort of like exponential pickups as somebody with like a very, very large number of followers really has the capacity to get a whole lot of people paying attention to something. And so that's really the power that the influencer has. They can pick up something, and they often do, from the crowd, so they're having that back and forth. And in this particular case, this was a rumor that people's ballots, people who were in Maricopa County, Arizona, had been given Sharpie markers, that Sharpie markers had been given out to Trump voters specifically so that their ballots would not be read. That was the rumor that was that led to Sharpiegate. And what you see is, again, real sincere belief. We anonymize this because we don't want to call attention to ordinary people with sincerely held beliefs. But you can see that this one does get 20, 30,000 engagements, and they're tagging in influencers, and then the influencers do pick this up because, again, what wound up happening with Sharpiegate is it fed into the broader theme, the broader claim that the election was being stolen. So again, a rumor that served as a particular, that served a function for a political propaganda campaign, which was that the election was being stolen. That handoff, that transition from, again, sincerely held belief that is then parlayed into, kind of power game and political propaganda campaign is something that has been happening for a very, very long time now, and that's because it's very effective and it really works. And we made these charts in 2020, basically detailing that, you had these narrative dynamics, and for a long time, there was this debate in social science research that would say like, no, what matters is like Fox News and the elites are telling these stories, and from the top down, that's how, the elites are setting the frame, and Trump is saying it's being stolen, and that's why all of these people are coming up with these, finding this evidence, bolstering the idea of the steal. But it's really increasingly happening in the other direction now. It's really increasingly happening where now that the influencers have realized that this trove of people who for 4 years have sort of percolated in this deep distrust, they themselves are increasingly coming up with new and novel rumors, and so we're increasingly seeing that dynamic come from the bottom, where again, Fox News is the last to get it. So in this work in 2020, we studied how the platforms reacted, and we did these analyses of like, what could platforms, how should platforms think about the role that their affordances and their tools played? And we did a whole lot of, this report all in was about 200 pages long. And we really focused very heavily on something I know that we're going to chat about in the upcoming discussion, which is how do you balance free expression with an informed public? That was something that we really cared quite a lot about. And one of the things that we tracked was when we occasionally saw rumors going viral, like Sharpiegate, that was actually one that we paid a lot of attention to, we would engage with local election officials, and we would say, hey, this one really has legs. That curve, that's happening. Like, you guys need to get out there. You need to be putting information out. Like, this is very, very important. Again, per the point about the CDC and nobody being in the conversation, like, somebody's got to be in the conversation. Somebody's got to be out there getting information out there, because right now only the rumor is showing up, and you've got to be getting some good information out there. And the other thing that we would occasionally do is we would tag the tech platforms. So I think about 4,000 URLs all in for the 6 months or so that we were studying the election. Approximately 10% of the URLs that we sent them, they took down. About 60% of the time, they did nothing. And about 30% of the time, they put a label. The label just said, this content is disputed. For more information, see our election center over here. So we had this very academic project looking at how rumors moved, and again, more importantly, trying to understand how we should be responding to that. Could election official counter-speech make a difference? Could they get good information out to the public? If platforms were alerted to things that seemed to violate their policies, did they moderate in accordance with what their articulated policies appeared to be? And we tried to study this in a very academic way. with a 200-page final report. But, what wound up happening was that we continued our work until December, our real-time monitoring. We continued it until December. And then we sort of stopped our real-time monitoring of election rumors, and we moved into the post hoc, thing that you do, which is you gather a whole bunch of data and you start doing your analysis. You go and you say, okay, let's get all of the data related to SharpieGate now, things we might have missed in the moment. You start moving into this other type of analysis. And then all of a sudden, January 6th happened, right? And it was kind of a remarkable set of conversations that began to happen around January 6th, because the question of, what should platforms be doing stopped being just a matter of discussing policies very academically, because platforms immediately scrambled, and as they tried to figure out how to respond to this. You might recall that Donald Trump was deplatformed from several social media companies immediately after this. About 70,000 QAnon accounts were taken down. Facebook began to, they took down several, by this point, like I said, the political propaganda campaign, #StopTheSteal, they began to quite aggressively take down Stop the Steal groups because there were calls for political violence in those groups. And so the dynamic all of a sudden, this question of how do you balance free expression, the tenor really changed after this. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that because the conversation has once again shifted back to, were the responses after January 6th egregious censorship? But what happened in the immediate aftermath of this was the platforms tried to ask questions about what kind of content should we be curating, what kind of content should we be recommending. And what they did, particularly Meta, was they aggressively downranked political content, and they tried to just show people pictures of like weddings and baby pictures and content from their friends again. They called that the break glass measures. So what we saw in our work in 2020 was that online rumors and propaganda really matter. That viral rumors may not all have an impact, but that some of them really do. And it's kind of hard to try to predict which ones are gonna go in which direction. But that was one of the reasons why I think this process of trying to create rigorous academic studies of real-time detection and response was trying to come up with ways to quantify that, to determine what characteristics of rumors made them more likely to go viral and what should the responses be. It turns out that when you study propaganda machines, the machine sometimes decides that you are a problem. And so 2 years later, the House flipped to Republican control, and Stanford Internet Observatory was subpoenaed by Jim Jordan of the Weaponization Committee and then Dan Bishop of the House Homeland Security Committee. My institution struggled to adapt slide here I made when I first started talking about this in the context of the CDC, but it turns out it is remarkably adaptable because, the problem, unfortunately, is that I think institutions don't know what to do when systems are weaponized, and particularly when it is weaponized against them. And so the same way the CDC didn't know what to do when in 2015, they were being accused of literally burning documents in garbage cans, hiding the truth that vaccines caused autism, and that was constantly going viral. When all of a sudden, and they chose, by the way, to shut up and say nothing. When all of a sudden Stanford Internet Observatory became the subject of a rumor that our work studying election rumors had actually been a secret plot to steal the election by mass censoring all of the rumors that we studied. When we did that post hoc election analysis that I described, when we pulled all of the tweet data, for example, related to what we saw as the top 10 most viral rumors that had really become part of the big Stop the Steal propaganda campaign, they sort of summed up, we made a table, and the sum total of all the tweets added up at the bottom to the number 22 million. And that number was reframed by first a blogger, then the boys of the Twitter files, and then Jim Jordan and the Weaponization Committee as the number of tweets that we had gotten Twitter to censor. So you're being asked to believe that we had censored the story of SharpieGate, that we had censored the story that Dominion voting machines had been rigged, that we had censored the story that dead people were voting or that women were voting with their maiden names. So again, Dominion, you might recall, was received about a $750 million settlement from Fox News because that story went so viral and was so false. But all of a sudden in this retelling of it, we had somehow managed to get that story suppressed and censored. And so we were subpoenaed and we were asked to turn over all of our documents, and both we and Kate's team at UW and the other parties who were part of the inner circle of EIP, Graphica and Digital Forensics Research Lab, were asked to turn over sort of vast troves of emails to come in for voluntary interviews, things like that. So Stanford, I think, did a very good job fighting the legal cases, but it never fought in the court of public opinion. And so as those stories went viral on Twitter, as that rumor mill turned to us, we never put out very much in the way of counter content. We were really kind of encouraged personally not to do it at all, actually not to respond publicly. We were encouraged to only respond through court filings, through amicus briefs. And what that meant was that this created a vacuum where stories about us went viral and none of our content, none of our counter speech ever made it into the discourse and the discussion. And what wound up happening was that as this all went on, we wound up getting sued by Stephen Miller, I still have 2 pending lawsuits. It ultimately, the university decided, it said, we're not gonna do this kind of election research anymore. And it backed out of doing it in 2024, and it released a public statement saying that it wouldn't do it. And it really kind of capitulated on that front, in my opinion. It terminated several of us, including me, and it ultimately kind of killed the center. And it got nothing in exchange for caving, I just want to say. Immediately after it happened, Jim Jordan took a victory lap, and he, made a bunch of tweets saying that he had exercised robust oversight over Stanford University. He had shut down the censorship complex that had, participated in trying to steal the election from Donald Trump in 2020. And also he reminded Stanford that it was still under subpoena and that he would continue to request documents as he saw fit. I think it's a little bit of a wild claim for an elected official to make about the First Amendment protected research of an American institution, and I really wish that we had made a much stronger stand at the time, saying that it was actually our First Amendment rights that were being stifled, that it was our freedom of speech that was being suppressed by the American, by these members of Congress who chose to spread these rumors about us. And I think that unfortunately we're going to be seeing a whole lot more of that happening now, as this administration has chosen to use executive orders and other means of power to chill speech and to make examples of people in order to make other people afraid to speak up. And so my sincere hope is that universities recognize that this is a collective action problem, and that speaking up is that you really don't get anything from cowering. You really just get you get members of Congress who will gloat and then send you more subpoenas and more demands for documents. So pushing back requires speaking out, and it requires collective action, and that requires courage. So what now? I think we're going to talk about the question of what does the future of social media look like a little bit in the Q&A and discussion. But I think what I want to emphasize here is that we're not going to fact check our way out of this. I think misinformation is really just not the term for it. And I have felt like that for a very long time. And we actually kind of rarely used it at SIO. We really felt that rumors and propaganda were much more appropriate terms because this is about shaping perceptions of reality. This is about people communicating with each other to try to understand the world, and to have those very real and important forms of communication picked up and manipulated by people in search of political power and in service to political power. And so I think that recognizing this as a very intentional playbook, one that works quite well in conjunction with a very real crisis of trust, means that we have to be thinking about different types of responses. I think we'll talk about policy, education, and design responses, but ultimately, really where it comes down to is like how we all show up on social media is critically important. How we think about the norms that we set in our communities and with each other, and then ways that our politicians show up. I sort of post this jokingly, but I really do mean it. I mean, as long as we have politicians who are incentivized to behave like influencers, we're going to get politicians who put showing off in front of cameras and hearings at the kind of top of their priority list, not passing legislation or doing things that are good for us in our communities. And then as far as just little individual things that we can each individually do, I think being cognizant of how you feel when you see content, why you're sharing. When you are clicking that button, it doesn't feel like you're really taking an action, but in the sort of collective sense, it really does matter. So thinking before you share, and actually just kind of going out and checking to see whether the content that you're sharing is good and is accurate. Really just diversifying your sources is really important as well. We can take actions to empower ourselves, to exercise our own agency, and to make sure that we are much more conscious of our contributions to viral moments. And I hope that we all get to shape the information ecosystem that defines our future.
Thank you so much for that talk. So I've had the absolute pleasure to get to spend some time with Renee today, and one of the things I've observed is you said something when we had coffee about, I think a lot of us, whether it's in institutions, academia, organizations, have this tendency to kind of point to problems and say, and you said this, somebody should do something about that problem. And I think one of the things that you'll find as you hear Renee talk about her work and her lived experiences, and something that I'm just so kind of impressed and inspired by is the extent to which you step up and do something about these issues. And so one of the things I know everybody kind of pointed to in their registration questions was this notion of solutions, right? That we, I have to recommend the book, and I think the discussion of the interplay between influencers, algorithms, and crowds and the way information moves through our ecosystem is absolutely brilliant. But one of the things I know a lot of folks are concerned about is, so, okay, this is the problem, you've eloquently described it, what do we do about it? And so I hope that kind of our Q&A can focus on the responsibilities of, platforms, governments, us as users to kind of address this issue. And so before we kind of delve into that, I do want to, and you mentioned this as well, kind of think about this tension between free expression and online speech. And are there things that you wish people, even our audience members, really deeply understood about the role free expression does or doesn't play here as we think about solutions?
I think it is the frame for the conversation. Legally, it is not, but in terms of how we actually engage on it, in terms of the values that we're trying to create in an ecosystem, it very much is. I think it is important to keep that in mind because it's so culturally, particularly in the United States, where people go when they want to participate in political activism or when they want to find information or share information. So the other thing that I think is important to recognize is that there is some place on the internet for everybody at this point. So the idea that you're going to moderate more or take it down, it doesn't make the idea go away. It usually has a backfire effect and creates more demand. So oftentimes this question of what is the best response, I think there's an intuitive sense that a lot of people have. You would actually hear this from the public health folks. Well, why aren't they just taking down more of that kind of content? And the answer is that it just moves. You can take it off Instagram, you'll find it on X. It's going to be there. So coming up with ways to counterspeak, but also recognizing the limitations of counterspeech, which is that how do you curate it so that people actually see it? That's where you have this sort of structural problem where people are not having the same conversations anymore.
Yeah. So what do you see as the role of, because I think you've said here and time and again, we're not going to moderate our way out of this problem. So what is the role of platforms in dealing with this, just in your eyes?
Well, I think curation actually matters a whole lot more. I think how they surface content proactively is actually a whole lot more important than what they take down or what they even label. I mean, I am still a fan of labeling. I do still actually believe that fact-checking matters. I like it both in the professionalized sense, like the official fact-checkers, and also in the community notes sense, where you have a more crowdsourced way of doing it. I think both of those solve different problems and are both very useful. But the question of curation, I think, is actually really important. People are very, very surprised when they see other people's feeds or when they realize that if anybody's on Blue Sky, you can go and you can actually select different feeds. This is just something, because of the way the platform is architected, users have a lot of control over what they see. And so you can subscribe to different feeds and you can actually see your experience change by going from the equivalent of what might be like a For You to what you're following to topics or news issues or things that you care about, interest-based, or even kind of community-based feeds. And the tone and the topics that people are talking about are like completely different. I remember when I was much more regularly on X, I would have friends who were, much further to the right than me say, they would sort of toss in the latest outrage of the day that the right-wing media, that their sphere of Twitter was just furious about, why aren't you responding to this? And I'm like, I don't even see it. You have to understand, this is a thing that is not even on my radar because, your rage mail is mad about that, and mine's actually talking about this today.
Yeah, can you, you mentioned the way platforms surface information. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the new things, the ideas? I know you mentioned in the book some of these solutions, whether it's recommender algorithms that actually prioritize civil content from newsworthy sources, or what you call circuit breakers to slow virality. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those are? And then I guess I'm curious, is it realistic that platforms will take these on or take some of these opportunities to do this without government intervention? Will they do it on their own?
So for surfacing content in ways that are, the term is pro-social, a bridging-based system tries to highlight areas of disagreement that are presented but are not presented disagreeably, maybe is a way to say that. So there are very important topics that we have to talk about. We can't avoid them. They're critical issues. But we can talk about them without finding the most extreme, obnoxious representation of the opinion. Or we can talk about them without pointing at somebody and saying, look at that terrible opinion, look at that person over there, which is unfortunately oftentimes how political discourse happens, through mocking the other side as opposed to talking about the issue. So what the bridging-based recommenders are trying to do is surface something that might be a political hot-button topic or something that can go in a very sort of heated direction, but surface content that's posted a little bit more neutrally, in language that isn't intended to inflame the conversation. Things that shed, what is the phrase? Light but not heat, maybe is the way to put it. This is possible, and it is right now not something that mainstream platforms like X or like Meta are incentivized to do. So, to get into the second part of your question, there's two different ways that you incentivize a platform to do something: is demand from consumers or regulation. And right now, the regulation piece is very interesting. The administration has just changed, and you are seeing some very interesting dynamics happening where Meta settled a court case with Trump that it clearly would have won, but it did it to, be in good graces. And so the relationship between platforms, and of course X's CEO is also kind of co-running the government. So the dynamics between government and tech are different now than they were. The question, so I don't think that they're as concerned about how things will be regulated, but there is regulation that is coming out of Europe. There are some questions related to interoperability and user control that they're kind of required to do for European regulation. Whether the American administration will protect them from the demands of the European regulators is something that I think we're gonna get an answer to pretty quickly in the next couple of weeks. But this is always the tension that exists. The other option, though, is users trying to, kind of saying, we want something different. And one way that users can signal that is by going to other platforms that offer it to them. So you are starting to see people leaving X and going to other places, leaving X and going to Threads, leaving X and going to Blue Sky. This is happening more for political vibes than because they, but the political vibes are in part because they don't like what's being curated for them, and they don't have really very much control over how to flip it back. So I think there is some incentive for the platforms to offer it as here's the future of social media. It's giving users more control. We want you to have more control, so here you are. But in the meantime, platforms like Blue Sky are already offering it, and so users can actually just kind of go over there and experience it. And hopefully, we're going to see more demand and more development happening in alternative platforms as people begin to realize that they don't have to be on one of the big three platforms anymore. If they don't like it, if it doesn't align with their values, if it makes them feel anxious or angry, then there are places that they can go.
Yeah. I'm curious, I know it's dark when we look out and see you all, you're pretty dark, but how many folks are on Blue Sky? Handful, okay. Can you talk a little bit, because I know we're gonna kind of get into this, what is, when you say, oh, it's different, what's different about Blue Sky than those big three?
Blue Sky is intended, it's early right now, but some of the architectural choices that they're making will eventually enable other people to run their own versions of it. So if you wanted to run a version of the Blue Sky protocol, but with your own particular types of rules or your own particular types of community, the intent is for it to be modular. Same thing with the Fediverse is another example of an architecture where a particular community could run a server, and somebody could, users could kind of go and get on that server and set their own rules and set their own experiences. So it's just a much more modular experience where that kind of control is not centralized and run by one person. The idea would also be that you would have an ecosystem of providers who build tools for these different types of servers. So you could subscribe to a feed curated by the New York Times, by Fox News, by your church, that it's supposed to be very, very simple and easy. That's the vision. It's growing, it's new. But I think it's one of the more technologically interesting things that we've seen so far.
Yeah.
And, I think it's very active. I've been actually surprised to see how much activity is really over there. Again, it is, I think, largely because people are moving for political vibes than anything else.
Yeah, so I want us to talk a little bit more about some of the specificity of those different user experiences, but you mentioned political vibes, and so I have to at least acknowledge kind of the elephant in the room as we talk about rumors, propaganda, and the impact that they're having on society today. Obviously, we've seen, and you mentioned this in your talk, Mark Zuckerberg kind of, for lack of a better word, bending the knee and rolling back what had been progressively better and better content moderation rules on Meta. We know that obviously, what are we calling him, Vice President Elon? I don't know what the appropriate terminology is right now, but if I could give you a crystal ball and look into kind of the way that this administration already is shifting just the process of content moderation and the impact, I guess I'm curious what you think the impact that's gonna be on the spread of rumors and disinformation. Are we seeing some things already happening? I know you mentioned even today we're seeing some pressure coming from the government on these large platforms to behave differently than they've done in the past.
So I don't think that Meta necessarily did it well, just to be clear. I think that they did, their false positive rate was high. A lot of people were very unhappy with Meta's the auto mods, as people call them, because I think every community has had some bad experience with Meta's auto mods, or with X's for that matter. This is partially because they're not very sophisticated. They would misconstrue the tone of a comment, or I actually am still in a pro-vaccine group, and anytime somebody would drop an anti-vaccine URL into the group so that physicians could go and kind of write a debunking or whatever, the group would get penalized for sharing.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And so people would start putting spaces in between the dots, and then you'd have to put it back together, and it was these stupid ways that people evade the tools. But anyway, so these are the sorts of things where it doesn't quite accomplish the goal, and you're sort of like, what really is the goal here? So because again, I think this idea that you're gonna the idea that this is, by the way, a secret group. This is not even, or private, I think is what they call them. It's a private group. None of this is being virally spread. This is not posted to a public page. So it's sort of funny that these sort of crude moderation tools, I think they just irritated people. And so I don't think people were, all that sad about it. But some of the decisions that they made were terrible. And that's because they did roll back some of the protections for hate speech that were quite clearly done for political reasons. And the problem is those protections apply globally. And so there are capitulations that are made for political reasons within the United States, where even if they don't lead to particular types of violence or harm here, even if it's just a speech function here, the implications outside of the country led to some real concerns for people. And I think that was where a big, and this leads to sort of another aspect of this, which is, why do we have an effort to establish global rules and global norms all in one place? The metaphor of the public square, I think, is terrible. I think it's wrong. I think it doesn't even make sense, because the public square implies that we are members of a community, of a shared public with shared values in a shared space, and there's never been a global public because that can't exist, that it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And this is where I think one of the, again, the reason why I actually like the decentralization and the movement into smaller spaces is that it recognizes that you cannot make everybody happy. So creating some of these smaller places where people can find that community, I think, is actually much healthier.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know if the audience is familiar with this idea of federated content moderation. So I don't know if folks are in like a Reddit group or spaces where, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how that might, kind of circling back to how that might disrupt what we see as the rumors that kind of circulate through influencers, crowds, algorithms.
So Reddit's a good example. How many people here use Reddit? Okay, cool. So Reddit has certain top-level rules. There are certain things that Reddit, the company has said, these are Reddit's rules, and all of the subreddits are responsible for adhering to that kind of top-level set of rules. But then the moderators of the specific subreddits can set their own rules also. And they can be very granular. No posting pictures of cats in the dog subreddit. This is a subreddit for people. No, I'm not even kidding. And these are the sorts of things where, like, look, you're coming into the dog subreddit. This is the dog subreddit's rules. Like, you can post the picture of the cat, but they're going to delete the picture of the cat, and you're going to get banned, right? And they have, they take this very seriously. There are a couple where they're like, you have to have a sort of a certain commenter score, evidence that you're not like brand new before you can post in some of the subreddits. And so, I remember not reading the rules in one, leaving a comment, it gets deleted, and the auto mod notification is like, nope, no, you don't get to post here. Like, sorry, but like, go get your cred somewhere else and then come back. We don't want unknowns posting in our subreddit. And these are just, this is like our community, our rules. And I think it actually works really well. And it's because it has legitimacy and buy-in, right? The people who are in the community are the people who say, like, these are the norms that we want to live under. Essentially, like, as members of the community, this is what we want. These are the sort of volunteer moderators who are serving this function and who are kind of creating this shared sense. This is sort of what the Fediverse envisions also, is that, but more in a distributed sense. So I think that this is the best way to do social media moderation, and I would like to see more of it. It lends itself more to group type structures versus something like X, where you're seeing a feed and it's much more difficult to envision what that looks like. So Blue Sky tries to actually apply a little bit of this federated model by having what they call labelers, where you can actually choose to have to subscribe to a labeler, and the labeler layers on it will hide certain posts from your feed in accordance with particular preferences that you set. So you can choose not to see, funny enough, the factions where I was like emoji in bio, you can actually choose to say, like, I don't want to see the people with bikes in their bio, and just like turn it off, and like all the transit people are gone, so.
That's amazing, that's amazing.
So these are the sorts of things where you're just, you just don't want to see it. You've got control, there you go. And I think that's the future.
So is that tool an example of middleware, which I know you're...
Ish. It's as close as you get, right?
Can you talk to us a little bit about what middleware is? Because this is another thing that can really kind of put control in the hands of users, right?
Yeah, so middleware refers to sort of third-party tools that are operating on behalf of the user. So it is sort of as close as it gets. Middleware generally also assumes that that there will be some sort of like compensation for those folks. Right now, it's still very much volunteer, but Blue Sky is the place to go to have that experience, because there are these essentially third-party volunteers who are using Blue Sky's infrastructure to make these labeler tools that can do something like what I just described.
Yeah.
So I think the labeler feed is the most accessible, off the top of my head, vision of middleware. Another example was, did anybody ever use Block Party on X? Or familiar with it? One person, there we go.
One fan, right there.
Block Party was just a better blocking tool, where if you were a person who maybe did political stuff or had a big account or whatever, and you would occasionally get mobbed by randos on X, it had a little thing where you could say, block everybody or mute everybody who liked this tweet or who quote tweeted this tweet. And so it was just a way to like all of a sudden turn off like a mass harassment mob. And you subscribed to Block Party, which then in turn handled your sort of like anti-harassment engagement. So again, this is sort of a niche use case that the average person I think likely does not have. But for people who have that use case, for people who are like big accounts on the platform, like I paid for it. I actually paid for it every month. And I think people who subscribed to it really saw it as something that made the platform significantly more useful and usable. And so it was a worthwhile expenditure to support a third-party tool provider. And that's one of the interesting questions with middleware is like, how do you get it out of the realm of being volunteer so that you're supporting the growth of a community? And how do we rethink social media instead of it just being this ad-based, we're all kind of passive consumers of this ad-based ecosystem where we're at the mercy of this very centrally controlled system? How do we create more of that opportunity to support these people who can make our experiences better?
Yeah. Are you worried at all about, we always hear about kind of the echo chambers that we selectively put ourselves into by who we like and follow already on social media, and then we add in these tools that kind of say, well, I don't want to hear from the transit folks or the bike emoji people, which now I'm definitely going to see what's going on in the bike emoji world.
That was a random one. I have hammer and sickle was the one that.
Careful, because she is the kind of person that will get an angry mob on X, so we want to just be mindful. But seriously, are you worried at all that with these tools, we're going to kind of continue to end up in these echo chambers and have these almost different versions of what is true or what is real? Or do you think, no, the experience, because to your point, when we do have kind of that harassment or the abuse that will happen, it keeps people out of the conversation?
So one of the reasons the goal of the mass harassment a lot of the time is to push people out of the conversation. And so I think the one thing I always wished Block Party had was some sort of like time delay whereby it would like turn it back off, where after a week I don't really need to have these people blocked anymore. I don't really care. They've lost interest. I've lost interest. But I think it's more a goal of controlling your experience. The same thing, I think, actually, with the labelers for filtering out certain types of content. So the nice thing with the labelers, though, is you can actually choose, like, you can hide something behind an interstitial also, so you can actually click in to see it if you want to. There are ones for AI imagery, actually, where if it thinks something is AI imagery and you feel like your feed is kind of overrun with like AI slop or whatever, you can actually turn that on and it'll filter it out. So again, the point is more to give you that granular control. If you really, I have actually been yelled at by the bike people, but I lived at the top of a hill in San Francisco and I was like, you know what? I said I had a car because I had kids. Anyway, didn't go over well. I follow people who are very, very politically diverse. And actually, there is a labeler on Blue Sky where there are a couple of people that the majority of the Blue Sky community really don't like. And there is a labeler for a couple of them where it alerts people that you are a follower of those people. And there are times when I will get replies from people that are like, why do you follow? And then the name of one of the people they find offensive. It's interesting to me for several reasons. One, it lets me know that they're using the middleware. So I'm actually cheered by that. I'm like, yes, they're using the labelers. Two, I think it's interesting that they care enough to subscribe to a labeler that lets them know that somebody's following somebody that they think is bad, as opposed to just blocking the person. Right? So there's sort of these questions around what are the norms that people expect from other people on the internet. I don't do psychological research. This is just something I find interesting as a person who exists in public on social media, and then also that they choose to make that a topic of conversation. And I'll usually try to say something funny back, like you should see who I follow on X, or. But no, I think it's interesting to me because it indicates that they assume that a follow indicates agreement or alignment. And I think of a follow as this is a person that I consider to be influential or interesting. And interesting doesn't mean aligned. Again, interesting means this is a person I think I should be paying attention to because they are important to another political community. Whether or not it's mine, it doesn't do me any good to pretend that they don't have significant influence. And so why would I not want to know what they're talking about? Why would I not want to understand their opinion or their perspective? It's not that, I think there's this idea that if you see content, you are magically persuaded by it. I think this is actually a mistake that people make kind of across the political spectrum, including, this was the idea when I was referencing that idea that people had in the old days before the 1947 study about opinion leaders, that people would magically hear something, the media would say it. This was called the hypodermic model. Somebody would say something, you would hear it from the media, and then you'd magically change your mind. That's not how it works. And seeing a tweet from somebody that you might find odious is not going to make you all of a sudden have that belief. And if you think about how you would react to it, that's obvious to you. But for some reason, when people think about how other people react, they're like, oh, well, if they're following that person, they must be prone to it in some way. So it's kind of interesting to watch the dynamics that happen as we're given these tools to use these labelers and things.
Yeah, are there things that you would say, especially I know we've got a lot of students in the audience, about how do they ensure that they're obviously not contributing to the problem of spreading rumors and propaganda, but just thinking about their own kind of social media diet and doing the kind of thing like you're talking about to really, engage with the tools that are available to curate a feed that is both informative, educational, connections with friends and family. Is there advice that you have for folks about how to kind of have a good diet of information on social?
I think I follow a lot, and again, I do it in ways where I can turn it off if I don't want to see it. I use Substack a lot for this also. I subscribe to a lot of Substacks at this point. Again, across the political spectrum. I use Substack as sort of shorthand for newsletters. Some of them are on Ghost or whatever. You don't have to read it every morning. You don't have to read it every day. Again, it's just sort of dip in and out. I think it's actually quite important, though. I think it sharpens your thinking. I think it gives you a sense of, helps you understand where your own arguments are in relation to other people, whether it changes your mind or shifts your thinking, or whether it just reinforces where you are in your own belief. I think it's just an important framework to have. I think it is very important to understand people who are profoundly influential, and so I do go to X and read Elon's feeds also. I mean, it doesn't do me any good to pretend it's not happening.
Doesn't exist. Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton
But also
of sense.
at the same time, I mean, I know it's, you go and you can come away irritated or, despondent, and so I think people dip in and out as it works for them.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned, and I want to be mindful of time, but one of the things you mentioned during your talk was just this notion of, the pushback against the situation we're in now, where there is just an enormous amount of rumor and all kinds of propaganda kind of aimed at misleading folks. We talked about kind of how students can, or even just regular folks can manage their intake of information. But in terms of that notion of collective action, are there things that you think that regular folks like us should be doing to address this problem?
I think that question of do I have to share and do I have to participate, or why am I sharing, why am I participating, what am I getting out of this, what am I contributing to with this is an important question. I think it's very easy to get into a reflexive mindset. This is also, because people, particularly right now, I think, want to feel a sense of agency and are looking for something to do, and social media feels like it gives you something to do. I think, unfortunately, that desire to do something can also just lead you to do it somewhat mindlessly, right? And I wish I had better answers. I do feel like we have a bit of a leadership vacuum in this moment, and I too very acutely feel that. So I am also out there, I mean, for me, I write. That's sort of what I feel like I can do, but.
Well, I think, and I would share this just from getting to spend time with you today and observe, I think one of the lessons that we can take from both your work and your experience kind of as a public intellectual is the courage to do, the courage to say, the courage to push back, as opposed to kind of sitting back and allowing these things to kind of swirl around. I mean, I think your work with the anti-vaccine, right, of like, there is this void of people saying, no, that's not correct. Let me correct the record. Let me say the thing that needs to be said. And if we continue to do kind of what I talked about at the beginning, pointing to say, well, somebody should. Right? If we all collectively continue to do that, nobody will. And so I think one of the things I hope we can all take from this time together today is like, when you're thinking somebody should, kind of point the finger around, and maybe that somebody is you. And so I hope that, I just know that for me, you've really inspired me to think about like, what is it we can all do to kind of push back against these phenomena that we see that really are having, as you've said many times, real world impacts, whether that's in politics, the economy, all over the place.
I think with that, I felt like in the issues that I choose to be very vocal and very visible about, it's something that I feel there's like a real personal connection to, and that for me is a big motivator. And so, not feeling obligated to do it for everything, feeling like you don't actually have to weigh in on all of the issues. You actually can say, these are the two things that I am going to put my energy towards.
Yeah.
And in a moment like this, where there's a different, the feeling of a different crisis or a world careening out of control, and there's like, 30 things have happened. I know, there'll be like 200 messages when you check your phone at the end of an hour. What are the areas where you have both a passion and capacity? I think picking those things and choosing to be a little bit more deeply involved, as opposed to trying to do all of the things, actually becomes very important.
Yeah, that's great to hear. As Jesuits, we love discernment, so that's
yes,
really
there we go.
that's our go-to. Well, we are right at 6:30, so I know we could kind of pick your brain and talk for hours, but I hope you'll all join me in giving Renee a round of applause.